this additional 26 billion that was just passed, bipartisan nature, and then signed into law by President Biden, 26 billion in US aid to Israel. Some of that is humanitarian aid for the Gaza Strip. Some of it is Iron Dome defense funding, and some of it is weapons aid and offensive military aid. What's your stance on that? Were you supportive of sending billions more in resources and dollars over there for this?
Yeah, I'm generally supportive of assisting U.S. allies or U.S. friends. I'm generally supportive of funding for Ukraine. I'm generally supportive of funding for Israel. I do think that it's good, and the United States needs to continue to kind of like rein in the potential humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip. So building that pier is good. Pressuring Israel to open up more ports or passages is good, to try to make sure that food is not only just getting into the Gaza Strip, but also being distributed, because they're having big problems with distribution in there as well. So it's important to keep them reined in somewhat, but it would take a lot for me to say we need to just stop funding somebody we consider an ally.
Well, I don't see why we should be funding it at all for a couple of reasons, but one of which is just the majority of Americans no longer support what Israel is doing. I mean, we've got Gallup polling from March of 2024. 55% of Americans now disapprove of Israel's military campaign in Gaza. I don't see why should they be forced to fund something they don't support. A majority of the public doesn't support this.
I would have to. What is the breakdown on polling like that? Does that draw evenly from every age group? Because my understanding is that right now the opposition skews very, very, very heavily on the younger side. I don't know if the older side has started to switch on that opinion yet, but I mean, if the question is like, should our funding only go towards whatever currently has popular support? But my answer is going to be, well, no, I don't think that that's how funding for the U.S. should work. That if like the polls sway a few points, all of a sudden we pull the plug on whatever international ally we have. I think the United States would be seen as incredibly unreliable at that point.
But we're not talking about library funding, right? We're talking about weapons. We're talking about aid that's being used to kill people. Probably one of the most controversial forms of spending you could have.
But yeah, the answer doesn't change. I mean, like the same question is going to, I mean, hopefully it does, but the same question is going to come up in Taiwan soon, right? And let's say that the support for Taiwan is like 53% of the United States and they get engaged in a huge struggle against China. Are we pulling the plug on that when the polling changes to 49%? I think we have to have a bit more sophisticated of an approach to foreign policy than just what does the current Gallup poll say about Americans' opinions about a current conflict?
Well, I think when you have a huge swath of the public that, I mean, rightly or wrongly, they do believe what's happening is a genocide. They do believe Israel's targeting civilians. I think the idea that their money's being forcibly taken out of their paychecks and sent over there to fund that is really strongly objectionable from a freedom of conscience point of view.
Vote for new leaders. I mean, that's all you can really do then. Make sure in the next election, I guess, it was a strong issue for you. Make sure your voice is heard and vote accordingly.
I also don't understand, though, why Israel needs this aid. I mean, Israel is an incredibly wealthy nation. They have a very advanced military, and they're up against Hamas. It's a David Goliath situation, right? It's not a close fight. They're not evenly matched, right? They already have an enormous military advantage. Why do they even need our aid or need our assistance? Why is that even necessary?
I think one is because Israel doesn't see itself as only opposing Hamas. They also see themselves fighting basically proxy wars with Iran. So that might come in the form of missile shot from Yemen, from the Houthis. It might come in the form of attacks from Hezbollah in Lebanon. It might come in the form of attacks of proxy groups that stage attacks from Syria into Israel. They still see these other fronts as being somewhat active for other people that they're fighting in the region. And then Israel has to conduct an incredibly expensive war because Israel, as much as people say they're just flattening Gaza and they just want to blow everything up, they're not. And the precision guided munitions, the videos where you see like 3 or 4 people getting shot by a singular missile, like these missiles are really expensive. The types of ISR you're doing, the types of weaponeering you're doing, you're spending like, $500,000, $1 million plus on some of these strikes. It gets expensive unless you do want them to just carpet bomb everything, in which case it's a lot cheaper. But the civilian death toll would actually be unbelievably high at that point.
I mean, they have flattened most of northern Gaza. No?
No.
So many people have been displaced and don't have homes to go back for. You can see video after video of just entire streets of destroyed buildings.
Yeah, there are certain blocks that have been heavily damaged, and you see the exact same drone footage of these same places over and over and over and over again. But we heard the same thing in 2008, heard the same thing in 2014, that all of Gaza is flat and nobody will have anywhere to go, and somehow they all find houses again. The humanitarian aid pours in, you rebuild, and people have places to go. And I mean, like it's tragic, it sucks. I'm not trying to downplay how horrible the war terrorists, but I'm also trying to push against the weird over exaggeration on the other end that like all of Gaza is destroyed. You look at some of these numbers, people will be like 80% of buildings have been completely destroyed, and then you look at where the numbers come from, and it's like, it's actually like 34% of buildings have been damaged and like 12% have been like completely destroyed, because that 80% was actually just houses in like a certain city. And it's just like so much exaggeration and misinformation. I was going through 2 days ago in preparation for another debate for the starvation claims. And man, over the past like 5 months, I had like 50 different articles that came up. That's like imminent mass starvation, imminent people about to start starving to death, starvation deaths about to pass over the deaths from the airstrikes for 5 months. Every single day there's like a different article about this. Like, holy Jesus. And like up to this day, and it's tragic if it's happened, but up to this day, going with the most favorable number, which is Al Jazeera reporting Hamas, 32 people have died from either starvation or malnutrition or disease related stuff related to starvation. Like 32 people, which is tragic. But in an area of 2 million people, we've been told for months they're all about to die of starvation. Like, what's actually happening here with the reporting?
I mean, there's always this fog of war, especially when you have authorities that are run by extremist groups, right? You don't have good information, but it seems hard to deny that there isn't a huge swath of people who have been displaced, that there aren't huge civilian casualties and a human loss being incurred right now, and that there's not a dire humanitarian crisis in Gaza. You wouldn't deny that, would you?
There's definitely a humanitarian crisis. There's definitely been a huge amount of people that have been displaced, more than at any point in the history of this region, for sure. There have been a lot of civilian deaths, but I mean, it's also we're conducting warfare in an area where you have the highest density of civilians ever. I hear this repeated over and over and over again. And you're trying to remove an enemy that is doing everything they can to induce these exact same types of mistakes, right? Hamas doesn't fight with a military garb. Hamas fights from hospitals. They hide munitions in buildings. Like, all of this stuff has been reported by Amnesty International. You don't have to take Israel's word for it. They operate out of hospitals. And when we say fog of war, it's also not just fog of war. The Al Ali hospital bombing that everybody said for, like 4 days was bombed with a JDAM by Israel that ended up being complete horse bull or whatever. I don't know if you're all cussing here or not, but like the idea that this is just
from
fog
the
of
Israel
wars
side that have turned out to not be true as well.
Yeah, sure. But that was like on October 18th, that was like in the first week or two of the war. And you have this like idea that Israel is just bombing a hospital and blowing it up completely and killing 500 people. And that's not just a fog of war report. That was a total BS claim.
But Israel has bombed some hospitals in the Gaza Strip.
Yeah, they have. I mean, but also Hamas operates out of hospitals. We just saw that Al Shifa raid a month ago, right? Where 900 people ended up getting arrested in that conflict. Is when you start operating out of hospitals, hospitals lose their distinction as a non-military target, and this is what Hamas does.
I mean, is there any limit to that though? Like, is there any? I understand what you're saying, and that is one of the points that gets debated in this, right? Is like, it is a safe zone, but then when you start using it for military purposes, is it fair game? But I mean, is there any limiting principle to that? If there's 50,000 people you had to shoot through, obviously that's not the case. But I'm like, is there any limiting principle to how much damage you can do just to get to Hamas? Because pretty much everybody who's rational agrees that Hamas is a terrorist group. Israel has a right to try to destroy them. But is there any limiting principle to how many innocent people can be caught in the crossfire before Israel has a moral obligation to not pull the trigger on some of this stuff?
Yeah, you're supposed to be doing proportionality analyses to make sure that the amount of civilian harm that's being caused is like in proportion to the overall aim of your military objective in any given individual attack. So, I mean, you're hoping that they're doing these proportionality assessments. But I mean, when you look at the overall number of deaths and you compare like the ratio of civilians killed to militants killed, even if we go by the most favorable numbers, which are Hamas numbers, I think they came out and said like 7,000 or 8,000 of the dead were militants. That's still like a 1-to-3, 1-to-4 ratio of militants to civilians, which is already lower than any other armed conflict we've ever seen in the most densely populated area. So the idea that Israel is like indiscriminately bombing civilians, it doesn't pass any sort of numbers test at all. Like, it seems like there is an incredibly high level of discrimination going on here if that's the ratio in the hardest to operate environment against an enemy that is trying to induce these types of mistakes.
What do you mean by discrimination?
Discriminating between civilian and non-civilian targets, or discriminating against military and non-military targets. Most people claim that the fighting is indiscriminate, that they're bombing whatever, but it seems like a high level of discrimination must be happening if the ratio of militant to civilian killed is like 1-to-3, 1-to-4.